Here by Chris Hedges. This is at Mint Press. I'll link down below. Chris Hedges, The Collective Suicide Machine. And of course, all of the artwork on his articles is done by Mr. Fish. You are which are always quite interesting. Princeton, New Jersey. Originally it looked like from SharePost. The debacle in Afghanistan, which will unravel into the chaos with lightning speed over the next few weeks and ensure the return of the Taliban to power, is one more signpost of the end of the American empire. The 2 decades of combat, the $1 trillion we spent, the 100,000 troops deployed to subdue Afghanistan, the high-speed tech gadgets, AI, cyber warfare, Reaper drones armed with Hellfire missiles, and GBU-30 bombs, and Global Hawk drones with high-resolution cameras, Special Operation Command, composed of elite Rangers, SEALs, and air commandos, black sites, torture, electronic surveillance, satellites, attack aircraft, mercenary armies, infusions, millions of dollars to buy from bribe the local elites and train an Afghan army of 350,000 has never exhibited the will to fight, failed to defeat the guerrilla army of 60,000 that funded itself through opium production and extortion in one of the poorest countries on earth. That is a huge, long sentence. Like any empire in terminal decay, no one will be held accountable for the debacle or for the debacles in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, or anywhere else. Not the generals, not the politicians, not the CIA and intelligence agencies, not the diplomats, not the obsequious courtiers in the press who serve as cheerleaders for the war, not the compliant academics and area specialists, not the defense industry. Empires at the end are collective suicide machines. The military becomes, in late empire, unmanageable, unaccountable, and itself endlessly self-perpetuating. No matter how many fiascos, blunders, and defeats it visits upon the carcass of the nation, or how much money it plunders, impoverishing the citizenry and leaving governing institutions and the physical infrastructure decayed. I mean, can't argue with any of that, right? We all see that very present in the United States right now, in the imperial core. Human tragedy, at least 801,000 people have been killed by direct war violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan. 37 million have been displaced in and from Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Philippines, Libya, and Syria, according to the Watson Institute of Brown U. Is reduced to a neglected footnote. As dehydrated with all this reading. Nearly all the roughly 70 empires during the last 4,000 years, including the Greek, Roman, Chinese, Ottoman, Habsburg, Imperial German, Imperial Japanese, British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Soviet empires, collapsed in the same orgy of military folly. Roman Republic at its height lasts only 2 centuries. We are set to disintegrate into roughly the same time. This is why at the start of World War II in Germany, Karl Liebknecht called the German military, which imprisoned and later assassinated him, the enemy from within. Mark Twain, whose politics seem pretty decent, honestly, who was a fierce opponent of the efforts to plant the seeds of empire in Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, wrote an imagined history of America in the 20th century, where its lust for conquest had destroyed the Great Republic because trampling upon the helpless abroad had taught her by a natural process to endure with apathy the like at home. Multitudes who applauded the crushing of other people's liberties lived to suffer for their mistake. I mean, again, you could see, what the U.S. empire does abroad, those techniques of coercion, repression, violence, stifling dissent, continue to be used on the people in the imperial core. So Twain's point, very, very well taken. Twain knew that foreign occupation designed to enrich the ruling elites used occupies pops as laboratory rats who perfect techniques of control that soon might migrate back to the homeland. His brutal colonial policing practices in Philippines, which included a vast spy network along with routine beatings, tortures, and executions, which became the model for centralized domestic policing and intelligence gathering in the U.S. Israelis' armed surveillance and drone industries test their products on the Palestinians. One of the dark ironies was American empire, led by Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, probably butchering that, which spawned the mess of Afghanistan. Yep, Brzezinski oversaw a multi-billion-dollar CIA covert op to arm, train, and equip the Taliban to fight the Soviets, then who later went on to fight the U.S. when we went into Afghanistan. This clandestine effort sidelined the secular democratic opposition and assured the ascendancy of the Taliban in Afghanistan, along with the spread of radical Islam into Soviet Central Asia once Soviet forces withdrew. The American empire would years later find itself desperately trying to destroy its own creation. In April 2017, a classic example of this kind of absurd blowback, the U.S. dropped the mother of all bombs, the most powerful conventional bomb in the American arsenal, on an Islamic State cave complex in Afghanistan that the CIA had invested millions in building and fortifying. Talk about the fucking sadistic, irony. Attacks of 9/11 were not an existential threat to the U.S. Agreed. They're not politically significant. I mean, they ended up being politically significant, what happened as a result, but in and of itself, I agree. They did not disrupt the balance of global power. They were not an act of war. They were act of nihilistic terror. The only way to fight terrorists is to isolate them within their own societies. I was in the Middle East for the NYT after the attacks. Most of the Muslim world was appalled and revolted at the crimes against humanity that had been carried out in the name of Islam. If we had the courage to be vulnerable, to grasp that this was an intelligence war, not a conventional war, we'd be far safer and secure today. Definitely not any safer or more secure. These wars in the shadows, as the Israelis illustrated when they tracked down the assassins of their athletes in the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich, takes months, even years of work. But the attacks give the ruling elites less for control, especially Iraq, which had nothing to do with the attacks, the excuse to carry out greater strategic blunder, American history, invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly Iraq, right? Architects of the war, including then Senator Biden, knew little about the countries being invaded, did not grasp the limits of industrial and technocratic war and the inevitable blowback that would see the United States reviled through the Muslim world, most of the world as it should be. They believed they could implant client regimes by force throughout the region, use oil revenues in Iraq, since the war in Afghanistan would be over in a matter of weeks, to cover the costs of reconstruction, magically restore American global hegemony. It did the opposite. Invading Iraq and Afghanistan, dropping iron fragmentation bombs on villages and towns, as well as using chemical weapons like those white phosphorus bombs in Iraq, probably Afghanistan too. Kidnapping, torturing, imprisoning tens of thousands of people, using drones to sow terror from the skies, resurrected the discredited radical jihadists as a potent recruiting tool in the fight against U.S. and NATO forces. We were the best thing that ever happened to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban because they were able to, recruit. Look at what the U.S. empire is doing. Look at what they're doing in all of these Islamic countries. Look at what they're doing, to people in Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay. So he's on point there. There's little objection within the power structure to these invasions. The congressional vote was 518-1 in favor of empowering Bush to launch a war, Barbara Lee being the lone dissenter. Those of us who spoke out against the idiocy of the looming bloodlust were slandered, denied media platforms, and cast into the wilderness where most of us remain. Those who sold us war kept their megaphones, a reward for their service to empire and the military-industrial complex. It did not matter how cynical or foolish they were. We see that same thing still playing out, that same dynamic. Historians call this self-defeating military adventurism of late empire's micro-militarism. During the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians invaded Sicily, suffering the loss of 200 ships and thousands of soldiers, and triggering revolts throughout the empire. Britain attacked Egypt in 1956 in a dispute over the nationalization of the Suez Canal and was humiliated when it had withdrawn its forces, bolstering the status of Arab nationalists such as Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. While rising empires, quote, while rising empires are often judicious, even rational in their application of armed forces for conquest and control of overseas dominions, fading empires are inclined to ill-considered displays of power, dreaming of bold militancy, masterstrokes that would somehow recoup the lost prestige and power. The historian Alfred McCoy writes, in the shadows of the American century, the rise and decline of U.S. global power, quote, often irrational even from an imperial point of view, these micromilitary operations can yield hegemonic expenditures or humiliating defeat that only accelerate the process already underway. Blowback of the dollar, the loss will plunge. So the dollar being no longer the world's reserve currency, the loss will plunge the U.S. into a crippling and prolonged depression, force a massive contraction of the global military footprint. The ugly, squalid face of empire with the loss of the dollar's reserve currency will become familiar at home. The bleak economic landscape with its decay and hopelessness will accelerate an array of violent and self-destructive pathologies, including mass shootings, right, I have a lot of those, hate crimes, we have those, opioid inherent overdoses, we have that, morbid obesity, suicides, gambling, alcoholism, all this stuff already going on. He doesn't exactly say it, but I mean, these are all things that are products of the capitalist system as well. State will increasingly dispense with the fiction of the rule of law to rely exclusively on militarized police, essentially internal colonies of occupation, yes. And the prisons and jails, which already hold 25% of the world's prisons, but supposedly the U.S. is the land of the free. Even though I have 5% of the pop. Our demise will come more swiftly than we imagine. When revenues shrink or collapse, McCoy points out, empires become brittle. An economy heavily dependent on massive government subsidies to produce primarily weapons and munitions, as well as fund military venturism, will go into a tailspin of heavily depreciated dollar, failing to perhaps a third of its value. Prices dramatically rise because of the steep increase in the cost of imports. Wages will decline. Valuation of treasury bonds will make paying for massive deficits onerous, perhaps impossible. Unemployment level climb to depressionary levels, which we had, at the start of the pandemic. Still have, relatively high unemployment now as well. Social assistance programs, what they have already, will be cut. Again, we don't have a social safety net in the U.S. Hyper-nationalism, authoritarian state to keep in order, Christianized fascism. Last paragraph here. The tools of control on the outer reaches of empire are already part of existence, which become ubiquitous. The wholesale surveillance, we already have that in the U.S. Abolition of basic civil liberties has already happened. Militarized police authorized to use indiscriminate lethal force. That's obviously always happens, especially to communities of color, black people in particular, and people who speak out against, that police state violence. Use of drones, satellites to keep us monitored, fearful, along with the censorship of the press, social media. Already see that with the social media censorship and Biden calling for more of that. The U.S. government attacking those foreign media outlets as well, like press TV. Familiar to Iraqis or Afghans will define America. We're not the first empire to suffer this fate. It is a familiar ending. Imperialism and militarism, which again, imperialism needs to be pointed out, as Lenin did, as being the highest stage of capitalism, are poisons that eradicate the separation of powers, designed to prevent tyranny and extinguish democracy. The U.S. has never been a democracy. Those who orchestrated these crimes are not held accountable, and this means organizing sustained mass resistance. We will pay the price, and we may pay it soon, for their hubris and greed. Hedges. Original illustration by Mr. Fish. I always, appreciate Hedges' analysis and insight. I do think one thing he can kind of come off with a very, negative, depressed after consuming some of his content, just because it is so heavy. I think it is realistic for the most part how he describes things in this article, and the decline of the American empire and how we're seeing that blow back in different ways on the imperial core. But I also think it's important to highlight these acts of resistance that we see, whether it's those people in 50 cities across the U.S. marching for Medicare for all, or when Trump was ratcheting up tensions with Iran, there was people out in the streets, um, you know, for that, or people, whatever it may be. There's acts of resistance, against empire, against imperialism, that need to be highlighted, because again, it can be very easy if you're leftist and imperialist, if you identify as socialist, a communist, to get bogged down with all the fucked up shit happening both in the U.S. and abroad because of the decisions of the U.S. empire to serve imperialism. Get very easy to get caught up in that stuff and not see that there are still good things going on among all the chaos. So that's maybe one critique I have of Hedges. He doesn't always, I don't know, leave us with, maybe something positive, or this is like a concrete step that you can do. I think those type of things are really important, or people can just get very dismayed and apathetic and just want to recoil into their little personal shell. So that would be one critique I have of Hedges. Do you have any? What are your thoughts on this or any of his other works, which there are many? Like the video if you like the damn video. Subscribe for more content. Peace. Much love. All part of the people.